Alright, Elden Ring is full of lore, and surprisingly enough, the main bosses are just one big family, and a very weird one at that. I mean, look at all the characters that are the literal family to Queen Marika. By the way, what I consider the main bosses are the ones that drop remembrances. Seems fair enough. Within the world of Elden Ring, we hear of these outer gods, faceless, mysterious figures far more powerful than any demigod or god. One of the outer gods is called the Greater Will and is responsible for sending a golden star bearing a beast which would later become the Elden Ring. Queen Marika would be the vessel for this Elden Ring, as it exists within her own body. The Elden Beast would be the vassal for the outer god, called the Greater Will, meaning it would carry out its wishes. The Elden Beast is also the living embodiment of the Elden Ring, and is why when Marika and Radagon die, it emerges to fight you. But what's going on with Radagon and Marika being the same person? The game literally tells you this, but it's unknown if they used to be separate people that fused into one or have always had the same body. All we do know is that when they are the same person, they have different personalities, wills, and genders. As in the cutscene, we can see Queen Marika turn into Radagon. But well before that, Radagon was involved in a battle against the Carian Queen Rennala. But with a twist of fate, they managed to fall in love. The two married at the Church of Vows, where both their kingdoms were in sight. With Rennala, Radagon would study sorcery, and they would have 3 kids named Radahn, Ranni, and Rykard. When Radagon heard the news that Godfrey was exiled from the Lands Between, he left Rennala and gifted her the Amber Egg. Radagon would go on to marry Marika. As to why he left, we still don't know. This marriage, though, would make him the second Elden Lord, after Godfrey. Also, the fact that he married himself is weird, but just roll with it. This departure would leave Rennala devastated, and is part of the reason why we find her in the state that she's in. Now with Marika, Radagon would have 2 cursed kids, Miquella and Malenia. On the Night of the Black Knives, orchestrated by Ranni, a group of assassins would go on to murder Marika's son, Godwyn the Golden, which we can find his body during Fia's questline. Sometime after this, Marika would destroy the Elden Ring. For Radagon, he would attempt to repair it, although he failed. This event would be known as the Shattering and would start a bloody scrimmage of the demigods trying to acquire shards of the Elden Ring. Although by destroying the ring and defying the Greater Will, Queen Marika would be imprisoned within the Tree together with Radagon. As we know, Queen Marika is the ruler of the Lands Between, but to achieve that role, you must be an Empyrean, meaning you're born from a single god, have a consort, which is just a spouse, and a shadow, a wolf to defend that Empyrean. And before Marika met Radagon, Godfrey was her consort. By being the spouse to that ruler, this made him the first Elden Lord. Previously to that title, he was known as a barbaric warrior who had a ceaseless lust for battle, although it needed to be suppressed, so he took the beast Serosh upon his back. Now fitted to be Lord, he and Marika would have 3 kids, Mohg, Morgott, and Godwyn. As the Elden Lord, he led a war against the Fire Giants. The remnants of that battle can be seen on the mountaintops of the Giants, where we can also fight a survivor of the opposing side. Although after facing the Stormlord, the sparks in his eyes would fade, making him presumably useless to Queen Marika, which resulted in his exile from the Lands Between. This would also cause the separation of Radagon and Rennala's marriage. Now exiled, Godfrey would take on the name Hoarah, completely abandoning any of his previous ties, as well as the lion that suppressed his rage. During this time, he would have a kid named Nefeli Lu, although that isn't fully confirmed. She would eventually be left in the care of Sir Gideon Ofnir. Now after the Shattering War, Godfrey would come back to the Lands Between to become the Elden Lord once more. This is why we fight him first as his more royal self, then when he starts to get annoyed, as his barbaric, tarnished self. Let's now talk about what happened to the race that Godfrey faced in battle, and by the way, if you like the video, subscribe, it does help out a lot. The Fire Giants possessed the Flame of Ruin, which holds the power to burn the Tree. This was a direct threat to Queen Marika and her kingdom, so she appointed Godfrey to lead a war against them. Although their opponents wouldn't go down without a fight, and within each giant the Fell God lurked within. The Fell God, as described by the Fire Monk armor, is an ancient god of the flame. During this war, the giants borrowed from the power of the Fell God, except they were no match for Godfrey and the Knights of Zamor, so they were defeated. The outcome, as we can see, is quite brutal. Upon victory, Marika would discover that the flames within the forge could never be extinguished. She would then curse this fire giant to tend to the flame for eternity. From what we know about the Fell God, we can now assume in his second phase, the fire giant is sacrificing a piece of himself to awaken this god within. And yes, that is the god, as the armor and shield depicting him are very similar. But let's take a step back and discuss Radagon's wife. Rennala in her youth was a powerful champion who charmed the academy with her lunar magic, eventually becoming the master of Raya Lucaria. As you know, she would face Radagon in battle, fall in love, give birth to Radahn, Rykard, and Ranni, and then would ultimately be left by Radagon, with the last remembrance of the relationship being the Amber Egg gifted to her. This, along with the death of her daughter Ranni, who killed her physical self, drove her to insanity. She would become obsessed with rebirth, trying to perfect it. Although children reborn would be frail and short-lived, which we can see as they're somewhat malformed. As to Rennala's second phase, we don't actually fight her. Ranni wished to protect her crazed mother and left a spell as a safeguard. The person you fight is no more than a magic hologram, and actually has remnants of Ranni, such as summons, which Ranni's the character that gives you the summon bell. It's crazy to think because of their physical difference, but Star Scourge Radahn is the son of Radagon and Rennala. His red hair was inherited from his father, although his armor wore the design of a lion to symbolize Godfrey. Radahn at a young age grew quickly, and with the absolutely devastating knowledge that he wouldn't be able to ride his horse because of his tremendous size, Radahn decided to learn gravitational magic at Sellia. Under the teaching of an Alabaster Lord, he eventually mastered the skill, and with a specific sorcery in mind, Collapsing Star, it allowed him to hold the stars back. This would prevent celestial monsters from landing into the world. After Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring, a war started, and eventually Radahn faced off against Malenia. It was a tremendous battle that was stuck in a stalemate until Malenia released her Scarlet Rot. This infected Radahn from the inside out. Most of his body, minus the feet, were still intact, but his mind was gone, bringing us to present Radahn, who's been wandering as a mindless beast that feeds off of corpses. His loyal Redmane soldiers decided to create the Radahn Festival, an event in order to give their beloved general a proper send-off. This would free him from his never-ending suffering. Once killed, the stars he held back would finally fall, releasing the monsters he wished to protect this land from. And if you want a taste of what he was holding back, just look at Astel, Natural Born of the Void. Although it actually did come well before Radahn, but it still shows a fragment of what these stars inhabit. This monster would fall from the sky. It would eventually arrive in Nokron and cause its downfall, taking away their sky and leveling their city with a meteorite. This entity is actually somewhat similar to the other monsters that crash landed. As you can see, their designs and attacks are alike. Also, you can find less powerful versions of Astel throughout the game, although these are considered malformed stars, and an item describing Astel mentions of star debris that compromised the form of the Natural Born of the Void. So these weren't their original form, and it's a theory, but possibly it looked like the fallen star beasts until debris deformed it. But let's talk about Radahn's brother, and although they are vastly different people, Praetor Rykard still valued his sibling and held a portrait of him within his castle. But Praetor Rykard would go on to become the Lord of Blasphemy. While spending his time in Mount Gelmir, he would come across ancient hexes, which originated from a forgotten religion based off of a certain snake. This discovery would allow him to create new forms of sorcery. Eventually, Rykard would travel to a foreign land, and it's unclear when this happened, but he would go on to meet a dancer by the name of Tanith. Soon she'd become his consort, and after his transformation, the only human to remain by his side. Mount Gelmir would be the place he established as his kingdom, and deep below the ground it would house the god-devouring serpent. Rykard, just like Ranni, was outspoken against the Greater Will. This brought followers who had doubts about the Golden Order to Volcano Manor. It inevitably started a battle between Rykard's army and the capital. Although they were no match for the Iron Virgins, which if you didn't know were death machines designed to look like Tanith. These fallen soldiers would be hung around the environment as a display of victory. Rykard would become obsessed with immortality and the pursuit of power. This led him to feed himself to the god-devouring serpent and merge with the creature. After being consumed, as item descriptions say, he would degenerate into mere greed or fell from lofty ambition into gluttonous depravity. So he fell and fell hard. For the reason we face him, we need to take a step back. And as Rykard is against the Golden Order, he would desire to kill any tarnished. So his consort Tanith would send us out on missions to defeat those who oppose their will. Although little to our knowledge, this would be a test of strength. If completed, we would be deemed worthy to meet Praetor Rykard. Ultimately, their plan would be to have these powerful warriors be consumed by the Lord of Blasphemy, all to increase his strength. Those devoured by the serpent became the Lord's kin. Each skull and arm on either sword or body are these fallen soldiers. Although our story ends differently, and as Rykard fell to insanity, he would lose the following of his knights. They would turn to seek the weapon that was used to hunt the very being he was consumed by. Although when found, they would fail at killing their master. Their final chance would be to leave the weapon in hopes of the next warrior finding and using it to ultimately slay Rykard. After he's killed, we can teleport back to the arena and find Tanith consuming Rykard, all in a deranged plan for him to live within her as he did with the serpent. Let's take a step back and now move to Queen Marika and Radagon's descendants. While with Radagon, Marika gave birth to 2 cursed children, Miquella, who would stay forever young, and Malenia, who was born with scarlet rot. This disease would eat away at most of Malenia, who replaces her missing limbs with prosthetics. In search of a cure, Miquella would turn to the Golden Order's healing, but it didn't help. Hopeless, her brother decided to abandon the Erd Tree as a whole and try and replicate it. This resulted in him creating the Halig Tree. The closest to a cure he would get would be the unalloyed Golden Needle, although the best it could do was hinder the progression of the rot. Sometime after this, Miquella would embed himself into the Halig Tree in order to escape his curse and grow into full adulthood. This is why he appears within a cocoon as he's being reborn. During this, Malenia would go on to battle Radahn, which would come to a stalemate when she decided to release her scarlet rot, although this act left Malenia in a deep slumber. Fortunately, Finlay, one of her clean rot knights, accomplished the momentous task of carrying her back to the Halig Tree. However, sometime during her battle or slumber, Miquella was cut out of the tree and stolen by Mohg. If you look closer, we can see the hole he was cut from and the outline of a body. We now encounter Malenia waiting for her brother's return. But there's one item that is vital to explaining Malenia's backstory, and that is the Scarlet Ionia spell, which reads that with every bloom her rot advances, and with the third she will become a true goddess. Each of these blooms can be seen. One at the intro, one before her fight, and the third and final one before her second phase, meaning that before all of this, she was not in full godhood until we eventually fought her, and in her second phase she now goes by the name of Goddess of Rot. With this knowledge of Miquella, we can now move to the Cursed Omen twins. Morgott, the son of Godfrey and Queen Marika, was born in Omen, a being with cursed blood. Those afflicted by this curse would have horns sprouting out their body. Creatures with this defect would have their horns cut off, usually resulting in death. But if born in royalty, their defect would be left untouched, although they would be shunned to the sewers below Leyndell. Morgott and his brother Mohg were kept here, imprisoned by magic shackles. It was until the Shattering War that they were able to escape. With Queen Marika sealed within the tree, Morgott took the throne of Leyndell in order to preserve the Erd Tree. To protect it, he would deem a not-so-clever false identity called Margit, and with his true sword being imbued with cursed blood, he hid it within his cane. Margit, the Fell Omen, would guard the entrance to Stormvale. He wished to kill any tarnished and squash their ambitions before they became powerful enough to threaten the Erd Tree. Mohg, his brother, had other plans. Just as his sibling did, he also escaped during the Shattering. Although while his twin was becoming the Lord of Leyndell, Mohg was on a much different path, and he resented the cursed blood that he was born with. Deep underground, he encountered an outer god, the Mother of Truth, who granted his blood power. His weapon he would use to commune with this outer god. But while Malenia was in a deep sleep recovering from her battle with Radahn, Mohg managed to cut out Miquella from the Halig Tree during his rebirth. With Miquella being an Empyrean, he could be the consort to him and therefore the next ruler. This would allow him to establish his dynasty. Although he desired to raise him to full godhood first, except it never worked. No matter how much he shared his blood, there was no result. And even the base of his desires are in question, as it's said that his dream of creating a dynasty could just be the raving of a lunatic. Godrick the Grafted is a distant descendant of Queen Marika and Godfrey, although he would only ever be a shell of his family, and is considered the runt of the litter. In his earlier days, he was nothing special, just a feeble old man. During the Shattering, he successfully captured a piece of the Elden Ring, although I have no clue how. For an unknown reason, he would be persecuted from Leyndell and would take some treasures along with him. To escape, he hid himself among a group of women fleeing the capital. Later, he would have to hide once again, this time from Radahn. Although the embarrassment wasn't over, and after insulting Malenia, he lost to her in battle and had to beg on his knees for his life. This shame would torture Godrick, as he wished to live up to his descendants. He would then turn to grafting to fabricate his strength. If you don't know, grafting is the act of transporting living tissue. This would be done within Stormvale Castle by killing tarnished and stealing their limbs. This act would also be done to other beings. Godrick desperately tried to cling to his heritage, which can be seen within his castle as there's a giant painting depicting Godfrey. This joke of a lord wouldn't amount to much, and even his attempt of grafting a dragon head still wasn't enough. According to old legends, wolves are the shadows of the Empyrean, and Marika would be no exception. Maliketh, her half-brother, would have that role. As Queen Marika wished for her and the demigods to live eternally, she removed the Rune of Death. It would be bonded to the sword that Maliketh now carries. Although on the Night of the Black Knives, a piece of that death would be stolen from him and imbued into the assassin's daggers. This allowed them to kill Marika's son, Godwyn the Golden. After that fatal mistake, Maliketh bound the blade within his own flesh, such that none might ever rob Death again. While in shame, and possibly to further hide the Rune of Death, he took on the identity of the Beast Clergyman. Although now bound to death, it would create an insatiable hunger, and this is why we feed him these death roots. The reason why he's still alive after his fight is beyond me, but it most likely involves the convoluted time of Farum Azula. Lichdragon Fortissax is the sibling to Lanciax and is a beast that dwells within the body of Godwyn. In Godwyn's earlier days, he defeated an ancient dragon who went by the name of Mightiest Boulderstone. It would later be called the Lichdragon. But for some reason, Godwyn decided to befriend this fallen foe. This relationship brought the creation of the dragon cult within the Leyndell capital and the ability to harness the dragon's powers. On the Night of the Black Knives, the symbol carved into Godwyn should have taken the shape of a full circle, and since Ranni died at the same time, only his soul would perish while his body would remain. Toward the end of Fia's questline, we can witness what has become of Godwyn. When the quest is completed and we enter the deathbed dream, we can see what has happened to Godwyn's dear friend. As its remembrance says, this dragon has been fighting the death curse within his companion the entire time, although it was in vain, and the power of death overcame and corrupted him, leaving his once loyal friend as a destructive monster. There's also another very important dragon, and before the Age of the Erd Tree, dragons used to inhabit the lands between. They also had their own outer god, a similar figure to the Greater Will. Dragon Lord Placidosax would be the Elden Lord of this era, just as Godfrey was for his. Although their god would eventually flee, and this left the Dragon Lord to now wait in a place beyond time for its god to return. Deep within Nokron, there's a group of followers who were part of the Ancestral Spirit worshipping faith, which I can assume means they follow the Ancestor Spirits. The corpses of these dead beasts inhabit magic, such as the skull or horns of one, which are used by their followers. Although spirits seem to be a somewhat disconnected concept from the Erd Tree as mentioned. Also, it says life sprouts from death, which is a major idea for these ancestor spirits. It seems that the horns of these dead beasts continue to grow until they become an ancestral spirit. It's an odd concept, and I find it interesting because the skull of an infant one has no horns. So possibly once they die, the horns sprout and then the process of them becoming a spirit begins. But that concludes the lore of every main boss, and if you liked the video, subscribe. But as always, I appreciate you watching up until this point. Have a good one.